It's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Mosumi Bose, who is a member of the ULF board. She is just an incredible human being, as you will find out in the next couple of minutes. And by way of background, so her topic is From Silence to Science, How Speaking for My Son Helped Me Find My Voice in Rare Disease Research. Dr. Bose is Associate Professor in the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies at Montclair State University in New Jersey. We live minutes away from each other. She's been focused on studying quality of life, dietary assessments, and health equity in rare disease communities. Over the last several years, Dr. Bose has conducted research and published multiple papers on the role of the family caregiver, and we all know how important that role is, in the management of rare pediatric disorders, including 2 recent publications on caregiver-reported outcomes in patients and with proximal disorders. And so with that, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Dr. Bose and ask her to join.
Good morning. Oh, that's very loud. Thank you, Diane, for that really nice introduction. I am very excited to be here. I guess I have to stay close to this. I'm really excited to be here. I've been to a number of different rare disease conferences, and I love conferences like this where they really, where you guys really try to put the scientific component and integrate it really well with the family component. This is obviously something that's so important. We as families, we need the science to update us on what are the best practices for ourselves or for our loved ones, and also, give us hope for what is on the horizon. And, as scientists, we need families to inspire us and to help us understand what are the things that are the most important to the rare disease community. And that sort of melding of science and family, that's kind of the framework of my journey. I have a background in nutrition, and my journey, my career in science started way before I started having a family. But it was my personal experiences with my family that really drove and continues to drive my passion in research. So what I'd like to do today is just give you a big picture overview about what my research priorities are, talk to you a little bit about how my personal experiences with my family inspired those research priorities, and then just finish up with a couple of just closing words on my journey in rare disease research and advocacy. So these are my funding disclosures, and I will start with my family experience. So I was the primary caregiver to my first son, Ilan, who's pictured here. Ilan was born with a very severe form of a peroxisome biogenesis disorder called Zellweger spectrum disorder. Ilan passed away when he was 14 months old. He would have been ringing in his 15th birthday in a couple of months. And we as a family will still be celebrating him as we always do. We always tried to celebrate Ilan as much as we could, during his life and afterwards. And one thing that we did for a couple of years after Ilan had passed away is organize a 5K event called the Ilanathon, where we got to celebrate Ilan, raise awareness, and raise funds for peroxisomal disorder research. And I want to sort of start there because this was one of the first times where I felt like after going through this whole process of organizing this event, raising awareness, raising funds, and doing it relatively successfully, this was one of the first times where I felt like I had the ability to do something. And, and that was a pretty pivotal moment for me because, prior to me having children, I was a very insecure, not confident, uncertain, full of these, imposter syndrome type feelings, and I won't lie, I still kind of have these kind of feelings. I've just learned to turn the volume down on them a little bit. And I'm old because this is how I turn the volume down. But what that really did, doing this event, really gave me the confidence and the self-efficacy that I needed to really explore my interests in rare disease, like really reflecting on my experiences as a caregiver, and explore my research interests that I thought were important to me and that I also thought may have been important to other families like me. And so while we're talking about this idea of celebrating Elan, which is something that we did a lot, and I'm about to tell you about my research, which is very informed by my experience as the caregiver to a child with a very devastating disorder. And many of us in the room know what that's like. So it's hard, right? But before I talk to you about how hard it is, I always take these moments when I get to share my story and talk a little bit about, distinguish, life as the caregiver to a child with a rare, devastating disease was really, really challenging. And I'll get to that in a minute. But life with Elan, it was amazing, and it was filled with moments of joy. And I'd like to start with that first, is talk about that joy that we had during the time, the limited time that we had with Elan. When Elan was stable, we were able to walk around, the neighborhood for long walks. I loved to sing to him. His dad liked to read to him. One of the highlights of our time together was going to the Jim Henson exhibit at the Museum of the Moving Image in Queens. And, that was such a special moment for me. Part of it had to do with the fact that I am a huge Jim Henson fan. That may be evident already. But also, it was a really special moment because, in New York City, any sort of public place that there's all sorts of rules and policies, and, because it's so many things packed together. Most museums there had a no stroller policy, and we worked with the museum so that they welcomed Elan with open arms, and we came in with his stroller and his oxygen tank, and it was just one of those moments when you're in the midst of all this chaos that you feel being, taking care of, a very sick child. It was one of those moments where you felt like your village was taking care of your child, was taking care of you, and taking care of your family. So that was really, we really cherished every single moment that we had with Elan. But those times of being the caregiver to a child with a debilitating disorder, as many of us know, those times were really hard. Dealing with Elan's, multiple symptoms was very challenging. Elan had a trach tube with oxygen support to breathe. He had a G-tube. He was taking 3 or 4 different seizure medications, which still didn't take all of his seizures away. He couldn't see, he couldn't hear, he didn't hit most of his milestones. We, as his parents and his caregivers, we had to be up every 3 hours to suction his trach, otherwise he would have choked on his secretions. And because of his leukodystrophy, all of these symptoms just got worse until he eventually succumbed to his disease. And so, this is hard. That was one hard part of being the caregiver to a child with a rare debilitating disorder. The other part had to do with interacting with some of the people that were providing his care. And don't get me wrong, we were surrounded by a community that was always there to support us. We had some great medical care providers, but frequently or every so often, we would, interact with a provider who knew nothing about ZSD, certainly knew nothing about Elan, and would make assumptions about what he needed. regardless of the fact that they had very little experience with this disease. And I remember in one instance, Ilan had been admitted into the pediatric intensive care unit for an acute respiratory infection. It was the middle of the winter, and unfortunately, even the common cold would land us in the hospital pretty frequently because of his trach. And most of the time, when he was admitted for a respiratory infection, he had to be intubated. So one of these times when Ilan was starting to come out of the woods, but still intubated, his care team came up to me in his room, and they started talking to me about discharging him. And I was confused because he was still intubated. And so I was like, why are we talking about discharge? He's still on a vent. And they had informed me that they were going to take him, that they were going to send us home on a home ventilation system, which was really confusing to me because prior to this infection, Ilan was on room air at home. So I wasn't clear why they were pushing such aggressive intervention. So I asked them, I just need a little bit more clarification. Have you tried to wean him off the vent yet? And they looked at me and they said, well, Mom, this condition's only going to get worse. And so I looked at them and said, you didn't answer my question. And we came to the conclusion that no, they actually did not attempt to try to wean him off the vent. And when I asked them why, they said because of his condition, we didn't think he was going to be able to, so they just didn't try. So I took all of this in, and I looked at them and I said, so you got this whole unit here full of kids with RSV or whatever else infection that they've gotten, and many of them are intubated. And I'm just curious, are you planning on sending them all home on a vent without trying to wean them off? And this is obviously a rhetorical question, so when the answer was resoundingly no, I said, so guys, this is bias. This is bias towards my son because of his underlying condition. You are not affording my child the same opportunities you would afford anybody else in here simply because of his diagnosis. That is the definition of bias. So when I phrased it like that, they were very keen on trying to get him off the vent, and Ilan was actually able to get off the vent that time, and they weaned him onto a CPAP. He was able to wean off the CPAP, and we actually went home on a little bit of oxygen, which then transitioned into room air when we got home, and we were actually pretty good for a little while after that. But I think what this situation has sort of crystallized, and there were a lot of situations like this throughout the course of Ilan's life, but what it crystallized for me is that, and we all know this, but there are so many unknowns in the understanding of and in the treatment for rare diseases like CSD. And when you have these gaps, and I've just made this sort of thing, and it's not perfect, but when you have these gaps, these unknowns, what that does, it sort of forces people to make assumptions. And when people are making assumptions, generally, that has the ability to enable bias. And in the context of healthcare, that can oftentimes lead to disparities in healthcare. And I recognize, this is a very oversimplified sort of connection here, but I really want to just highlight the fact that it's this idea of these unknowns that are so pervasive in the understanding of rare disease that have the ability to contribute to healthcare disparities. And this is what was the sort of foundation of my research interests. And what I really wanted to do, at least as a start, is really try to help contribute to this limited knowledge base the best that I could to help minimize the risk of these potential disparities. So that's what I set out to do, is try to contribute to this knowledge base. And so I'm going to take a moment to talk a little bit about some of the research that I've done since my time with Ilan. And I started with ZSD just because I was very close with that community, and at the time there was not that much on published natural history of ZSD. And, I will freely admit I am not a clinician. I'm not a medical doctor, but I was connected to this community, this network of really informed caregivers and associated providers. So I kind of, what I did is I sort of gathered, sort of crowdsourced information from these very valuable sources of knowledge, and using that information, getting this feedback from caregivers, I was able to, with my colleagues, put together a cross-sectional assessment of symptom prevalence in ZSD, and with a number of great experts in the field, I was able to, and one of those experts is here in the room, I was able to help facilitate putting together a set of treatment guidelines for ZSD, and once again, just sort of gathering sort of expert guidance from the field. And I have had the great fortune of being able to communicate with members of my community who have used this resource, and the feedback from it has been so positive. It's just really, it's been so motivating and very inspiring. So I really love this sort of crowdsourcing approach, and I used it to expand my interest beyond ZSD. And another thing that I had the ability to do, that I was given the opportunity to do, was work with the National Alliance for Caregiving and Global Genes to come together with a guidebook for caregivers of rare and serious illnesses. And we published this in 2021. And if anybody's interested in this link, I'm happy to share it. This slide sort of talks a little bit about our research approach, but once again, based in that sort of crowdsourcing of information from these very knowledgeable caregivers that gave us an outline of this guidebook, and then once they gave us this information, we as the authors did a more deep dive research to provide details on the resources that they talked about that was helpful to them. And I'm really proud of the organization of this guidebook. Some of the chapters that I really love are the chapters that talk about the economic impact of caregiving, where we provide some financial resources to minimize that financial impact. We talk about self-care for the caregiver, respite and other resources like that. And one of my favorites is talking about advocacy, whether it's giving guidance to how to advocate for themselves as caregivers on behalf of their family member or on behalf of the broader rare disease community. So I might have mentioned that I have a background in nutrition, and since I started doing rare disease research, I've always been interested in leveraging my professional training in nutrition with what I learned in rare disease. And this is something that I've been exploring recently, and it's really funny with nutrition. I feel like I've talked to so many caregivers that have talked about how does nutrition play a role in my child's overall health. But if you look at the research, there's not that much out there, right? And I don't think it's because there isn't a role. I really do feel like, and maybe I'm biased because I have a background in nutrition, but I do feel like your diet, your nutrition, these are things that can have an impact on overall health, well-being, and quality of life for rare disease patients and their families. I just think that especially in certain rare diseases, certainly the case with a lot of these leukodystrophies, there's just a lot bigger and more urgent issues to contend with, and sometimes, trying to figure out the role of diet kind of gets put on the back burner. But this actually created a great opportunity for me, where I was able to explore this interest that I had, starting from the ground up, and that's really where I am. I'm still at the ground level here. I'm still working on this. Still sort of using this crowdsourcing approach. Now I think I've graduated to the point where I can call this data collection. And there's still a lot that's left to do in this sort of understanding, but one thing that I will share with you that I've learned in the research that I've done so far is that caregivers are really good. And when I say good, I mean consistent and accurate at reporting on their child's food intake. Okay, and this seems like a really simple thing, but if you take the skill that these caregivers have and use it in a research setting, you can actually get very valuable information on overall nutrient intake in these patients. And so I've now published a paper that has said this, and since that publication, I have had another rare disease group that is interested in looking at the role of diet in their rare disease population. So I'm looking forward to getting started on that work. And I think all of this, like I keep talking about this sort of crowdsourcing of information from the community, this feedback from caregivers and other members of the community, something that I felt very passionately about, and at a certain point, I felt like I was pretty good at doing. I realized that it aligned very nicely with the initiatives that were going on that's got started by the FDA with the patient-focused drug development effort. And with patient-focused drug development, as we know it, I love this idea of just taking input directly from the community and using it and packaging it and presenting it to people that were making decisions on future clinical trials, future treatments. So I have had the great opportunity to moderate two externally led patient-focused drug development meetings, and I wrote the Voice of the Patient report for one of those meetings, which is what you see of the screenshots up here. I'm in the process of writing another report for another group, and hopefully we'll be done with that by the end of the summer. So in doing all of this research, it's really funny. What has kind of happened as a result, it's helped me actually understand my own experience of being a caregiver a little bit better. And I've come to many revelations about my own experience as I'm talking to my families. And one of the things that I have come to the conclusion to, I don't know if I said that right, is that despite how devastating and tough I felt like my experience was, and it was, I'm not trying to invalidate that. Like my experience as a caregiver was rough, right? But I realized very quickly that there were many families that were facing different obstacles, harder challenges, more heartbreaking circumstances than I ever had to face. And the truth of the matter is, I took a lot of privileges for granted during my caregiving experience with Elan. I had the privilege of working in the hospital system where my son was born. I had the privilege of being able to stay with my son round the clock when he was admitted in the hospital. I had the privilege of having a background in science, of living in a metropolitan area. So many privileges that made it so that when I went to my son's doctors and I said to them, listen, I'm really gonna need you to try to wean him, at least try to wean him off that vent before we talk about a home vent. They were agreeable to that. They listened to me. Not all of my families that I've worked with have had those types of privileges. And I'll share one story about a family that I was working with, and it was a family that had already lost a child to ZSD, and they had another child that was in the hospital, and the hospital refused to let them go home with their child, and this is ironic, on a home vent. And so, little background, this child also had, their second child also had ZSD, and her health was very quickly deteriorating. And what the parents wanted is they just wanted to take their child home so that she could pass away comfortably at home. But she needed to do that because she was intubated. She needed to do that on a home vent. And the hospital absolutely refused. The intensivist that was enforcing this decision had cited hospital policy for this. But it turns out that this intensivist, based on their limited interactions with this family, and I will share with you, I will disclose that this was a young Black family. This person, this doctor, felt that this family would not be able to take care of their child at home on a vent. And this was despite the fact that they had already had experience with this disorder, despite the fact that they already had lost a child with this disorder. These are arbitrary decisions that were made for literally life and death circumstances. And I use the word arbitrary because just a couple months later, when that hospital had cycled in a new intensivist who was presented with this same situation, of this family wanting to take their child home so that they could pass away at home, they signed right off on it. And, witnessing these types of contrasting experiences across families has really made me just sort of dig my heels in a bit to really trying to better the landscape of healthcare equity, particularly in the rare disease space. And when we're talking about disparities in rare disease care, it's not something that's really talked about at large. So there's still a lot of work to be done. I'll talk a little bit about this new project that I've started on over the last couple years, and I will disclose that unfortunately over the last year, some of the progress in this project has really slowed down, and I'm hoping that we can get the momentum going back up again soon. But I'll tell you what we've done so far. Me and my team, we are looking at the existing literature that have looked at race breakdown across relevant rare disease outcomes such as diagnosis, symptoms and survival, clinical care and palliative care, and just to look at what are the differences across race. So, we're interested in all healthcare disparities, but we just started with race. And we still have a lot of work to do, but the one thing that we found across the 100+ studies that we've looked at that have, looked at race across these outcomes that I just mentioned, over 90% of these studies show significant disparities that are unfavorable to communities of color. And I feel like as we continue to, piece this apart, we're going to find more of these types of disparities within, within the rare disease community. And, like I said, lots of work to do, but hopefully this is something that will, these will be good assessments on what are the best calls to make regarding, trying to minimize these healthcare disparities and really promote healthcare equity. So I'm gonna start going towards some of my take-home messages. My first one, I feel like is so closely tied to this idea of healthcare equity. And it's very simple, which is why I say it a lot. And it's just this: we all deserve the best care. Okay, that's it. Simple enough. Regardless of how few people have the disease that you or your loved one have, regardless of what your socioeconomic status is, where you live, where you went to school, whether or not you even went to school, what you look like, and all of these things that really we know shouldn't matter, but still seem to in the systems that we have. And when I say we all deserve the best care, I also mean, we all, this means, adequate and equal representation and voices at the table at every single step of the process towards the best care. So that's starting with early community engagement efforts like patient-focused drug development, representation in clinical trials that emulates real-world demographics, equitable access to the most cutting-edge care, and diversity in medical professionals that provide this cutting-edge care. This seems like a laundry list of things that we have to do, but equity, when we're talking about healthcare equity, it's not like they're not checks that we have to check off. It's not a checklist. Equity, especially healthcare equity, needs to be a part of everything that we are and everything that we do. And that's something that I feel very, very strongly and passionately about, and it really informs my research. But that's not the message I want to close with. What I want to close with here today is, me standing up here sharing my story, it's not meant to show you something special or something exceptional, or even to tell you that this is the blueprint for, making a difference or making a change. This is just me up here telling you my story. And, I love to have opportunities to share my story with you because I love talking about my son. These are things that help me heal, right? But making a change, making a difference, advocacy, there's no blueprint for that, okay? Their advocacy can be, making a change can be a quiet conversation in a room. It can be a small act that you felt empowered to do because it was important to you. You know, all of these things, you know, are so powerful. And so this is my final message, is that we are all advocates here. You know, what you do, what you are, what you say, all of these things are so powerful. And even if you feel like you can't make a change, make a dent in this space, know that you already are. You know, you're here, and that's enough. And so while I have you here, I will say, you know, I will end with this. You know, to anybody that feels like, you know, that feels overwhelmed right now with everything that's going on, I urge you, just keep going, because we need you. This whole community, we need you. So I will end by just saying I had a lot of wonderful people affiliated with a lot of wonderful organizations that helped me throughout my journey. So I just want to give them a little shout out. And I will end for real by sharing a picture of my family. We have had 2 healthy boys since Alon passed away. And you know, I won't lie to you, it's pretty incredible how much these kids honor and advocate on behalf of the big brother they never got to meet. So thank you so much for your time. Should I stay? Oh, okay. Questions? Comments?
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. I was really curious to hear a little bit more about your experiences in the externally led PFDDs, and could you share some of your insights, what a successful EL PFDD looks like, if you're thinking for other leukodystrophies that might be interested in trying to have one with the FDA?
Absolutely. So we would be here for a really long time if I went through all the things that I learned. You know, and it was really funny because, you know, I went through that first one, and then when I got to the second one, I was like, wow, there's so many things I can do better here. So it's always constantly a learning process. I think, you know, making sure there's a couple of, like, you know, big high-level things that I think is important, and I think that's really making sure that your families are you know, ready to share their story and ready to share it, you know, to, you know, as thoroughly as they can, because that's really what the FDA wants to hear, is very, you know, very explicit sort of information on how these diseases have impacted their daily lives. And the more specific they get, the better it is for them to be able to utilize this information to help, you know, lessen that gap between, you know, drug discovery and bringing it to market. So, you know, adequate prep and really, like, engaging your community from the get-go, really empowering them. And that's sort of what this talk is about, is about empowerment, really empowering them, letting them know that their voice matters, and anything that they share, no matter how minute it is extremely important. So that's that sort of prep, you know, and sort of, you know, pumping up the community, I feel is a very important, and letting them know how, you know, well, I guess I already said this, but, like, just that this is so important, you know, just getting that information out there. This is such a simple way that they can make a difference, right? The other thing that I'll mention, and this is more of a logistical thing, especially because a lot of these ELPFDD meetings are hybrid these days, is get a solid AV team. And because I remember in some of these meetings that I have been involved in, we would have this sort of hybrid component. And I've seen it here too. I remember at the MLD session, like, there were people that were in the Zoom meeting, and it sounded like they were in the room. And I think that sort of, you know, that feeling is really important for these hybrid meetings, is like letting, you know, all the people that are there, because all that the FDA is looking for is voices of the caregivers and the patients, right? And just all of those voices in the room, they have such an impact. I remember having a debrief with the FDA after my second meeting that I had moderated, and the FDA, like, they were like weepy, you know, and I certainly I have no interest in making anyone cry, but you could tell that it was extremely impactful, and I think so. Those are, you know, there's so many other things, but hopefully that it has at least was a start. And if anybody wants to talk about the ELPFDD experience, please feel free to come talk to me. Yes.
There sometimes is a thought process that to hold an effective and successful PFDD, the organization must look at incorporating very expensive consultants into that process. So can you address that?
So I know that there are a lot of groups that have expertise in, you know, coordinating these ELPFDD meetings. So I think, you know, if you have the ability to use a consultant, sure, I think that's fine. I think if you have, honestly, the most important thing that you need in organizing an ELPFDD is an engaged community. And if you have that, and I think there are ways to defray costs, and I'm not going to sit, you know, I'm not going to make this a budget meeting, but it does not have to be. There are ways to have the FDA and other regulatory agencies hear your voice without having to, you know, to spend an exorbitant amount of money. So that's the simple answer is, you know, certainly it's, you know, whatever resources you have, if you can leverage them, great. But if you have limited resources, there are still ways to get your voice heard, absolutely. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Well, find me on LinkedIn. Thank you very much for your time.